Good morning. I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for coming here. Two special reasons I'd like to thank you for being here. Number one, it's 9 o'clock in the morning on the last day of the conference and after the night of the party and all of that. And the other reason I'd like to thank you is thank you for walking halfway to Indiana to get here. It's a long corridor down there. It's only just a few more miles to get to Indiana. My name is Scott Helmers. I'm a Visio MVP and also a partner in the Harvard Computing Group. We're a Boston area business process consulting firm. We also make a Visio add-in, and that accounts for a lot of what I've learned about Visio, which I freely admit pales in comparison to my co-presenter, Chris.
So I'm Chris Hopkins. I'm a product manager on the U.S. Office marketing team. Why am I talking about Visio today? I've been with the Visio product for,
Ever.
I think, yeah, most of my professional career. I actually started at Visio Corporation back in '95 before Microsoft purchased the product. So since '95, I've been helping MVPs and partners build solutions, pretty in-depth solutions, .NET add-ins, all kinds of stuff for extending the product and making it better.
Good. What Chris and I have in mind today is to dive down into some of the parts of Visio that we hope you've played with, but also we hope to show you some parts of Visio that you may not have played with before. Chris is going to go first, and he's going to concentrate on data and data linking diagrams to external sources of data, and also show you some very cool ways to visualize data. Visio diagrams certainly can be much more than just a picture, and that's really what we're both about today, is to show you how to get beyond just being a pretty picture. So Chris will do that, and also look at ways to communicate between Visio and other data sources, as well as help you communicate with the audience, the people who are consuming your diagram. And then I'm going to take a look at the way that Visio shapes can be made smart. And we're just going to touch the surface, but I want to show you some interesting things that you can do to make Visio shapes react to what's going on around them, react to changes in data in particular. And we're also going to just touch on the surface of a couple of the business process diagram types that are in Visio. This session is really not about business process, but I'm going to use a couple of process-oriented diagrams as the examples for what I want to show you. So with that, I will turn to Chris.
All right, thank you. So how many people here stopped by the booth and talked to the Visio people about data visualization, building? Yeah, I know, you were in the booth, yeah. So, as Scott was kind of mentioning, the things going over, talking about data visualization, how do we get insights from some of the data that we're working with? How many people in here are working with Power BI at all? Okay, a couple of you, not many, okay. When we start talking about Visio and data visualization, Power BI seems to always come into the conversation. The first question I get asked is, well, why are we using Visio to do data visualization? Don't we have other tools, more powerful tools? Yeah, there are, right? Power BI is certainly a very powerful data analytics tool, but the stuff that you see here on this screen, I would challenge you to configure those type of views in Power BI or any other tool, right? So I think the lesson here with Visio is that you have another tool for data visualization. You have another tool that you can use to build dashboards or add to your existing dashboards to get different views of your data, right? Views that make sense for your business. I mean, you can see here there's all kinds of stuff from maps to network diagrams to what's going on a manufacturing floor for certain pieces of equipment. So there's a lot of customers that we have out there that are building dashboards like this that connect directly to their data, that they just consume this stuff out of the browser, off their tablets, off their PCs. I've even been in situations where we've had large network diagrams on displays inside the data center that are completely unattended. People just walk by them and look at them, and there's a big Visio diagram that's getting refreshed constantly with data, so they can see what the status is, all their network equipment in that data center. So there's a lot of different uses for this stuff, and I think, you know, we've only got about an hour to talk about it. So, you know, with the contact information that you have for me and Scott, feel free to reach out to us if you have other ideas, other questions after the session, you know, to kind of go deeper where you can get more resources on a lot of this stuff. Because, you know, I think one of the workshops that I've taught in the past is 5 days of just working with Visio, building solutions on Visio, connecting data to Visio, building dashboards out. So, you know, we really don't have a lot of time to really go deep and talk a lot about these capabilities. So the tagline here, not just a pretty picture. You know, I think people are surprised when they look at Visio and they come talk to us at our booths, or they see some of our demos and we're connecting diagrams to data, and they're like, wait a minute, that's Visio, right? You've got that manufacturing shop floor. Where did you get the shapes? How did you draw that? How did you get the shape to change from red to green, right? And those are the kinds of things that we'll talk about today and show you in the demo. But one of my favorite lines is, you know, draw whatever you want, right? Put anything you want on that diagram, draw it, connect data to it. If you can get images from the web, some other application, if you want to draw your own stuff, and Scott will talk about shapes a little bit later, you know, put that all together into the diagram that makes sense for your business and connect data to it. Even if it's a simple org chart, and you've probably come by the booth and seen some of the org charts that we've had data connected to, we use that scenario internally on our own teams, right? We have budgets we manage, and so my boss has an org chart in Visio that she looks at, and it says, oh, hey, this is Chris's budget, and this is what his spend looks like against that. And it's simple data bars that are attached to those shapes in the org chart in Visio. And some of that stuff's generated for us out of the box. You know, just connecting to Exchange, and Visio builds that organizational chart out for us automatically. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff, a lot of those examples that we can talk about and go into. Data visualization, and this is, again, something that Scott and myself can probably spend days talking about, but the visualization piece starts with what we call shape behavior. Now, Visio, we like to say, has smart shapes, right? You draw a rectangle on the page, you're like, okay, well, how smart can that actually be? As Scott will show you, every single object in Visio has, I don't know what, 100+ properties that can be configured behind the scenes that you can use to make it smart. Obviously, this right here, this is probably, this shape in Visio that you see off to the right is probably actually a collection of about, I don't know, 30-something shapes that make the behavior, make the needle move, make the colors change, make the text update. But that's an advanced scenario. My point here is that build your shapes or find shapes that have the behavior that you want, even if it's a simple rectangle that's going to get wider and shorter as your data changes. You know, maybe it looks like a progress bar or something like that, or maybe it's a simple traffic light that turns red and green. But look for the type of behavior you want in your shapes. The second piece is connect data to those properties in your shape so that when your data changes, that change in the data drives that behavior in the shape automatically, right? You don't have to go into Visio and select some shapes and change the fill color yourself, right? Who in here is familiar with conditional formatting in Excel? Okay, yeah, everybody, right? Yeah. Who's familiar with data graphics in Visio? Okay, actually more than I thought.
Yeah,
okay, but still a lot less. So conditional formatting is the same thing as data graphics in Visio. You create a formula. If property value is greater than this, then green, else red, right? Same sort of scenario in Visio once you connect data to those shapes. So just as we go through the demo and stuff, think about what's going on in the back end, and then, as I said, Scott will dive a little bit deeper into the shapes and show you that you're not just limited to those conditional formatting or those data graphics rules that we attach to the shapes, but you can put in your own custom logic if you want to go that deep. So the data connectivity piece, just touch on it a little bit. We connect to a bunch of different data sources directly through Visio. Excel services, obviously, the Excel, any workbook, whether it's published locally or published in the browser in SharePoint document libraries, that's fine. SharePoint lists, both native and external lists. So that was something that was new to 2013, was the external list piece. And then SQL Server. Maybe you have some Azure database that you have set up, right? And you want to connect to that. There's obviously a lot of things that aren't on this list. And what I would say about those is that a lot of data sources can be connected directly through Power BI, right? Actually, most of my dashboards that I build today, I use Excel, I use Power BI, I run some queries to Azure, to web services, to web pages, a number of other things to bring all that data together into Excel. I publish that workbook in SharePoint, and then I just use the standard Excel data connection feature in Visio to get the data. Now, I've got some refresh challenges in that scenario, but most of the time, the stuff that I'm doing, I don't require an unattended automated refresh happening all the time. If I was going to do that, I would look at like BCS or SQL to get my updates automatically. Oh, another important point in this, and you'll see it in my demo here in just a second, is I think Visio can bring in a single diagram. You can bring in like 254 different data sources in one diagram. Now, that seems like a lot. It is a lot. My point to that is that you might have data running around in a bunch of different sources. So you might want to bring in data from Excel, bring in data from SQL, and then connect that data to a single shape in your diagram and do some custom behavior with it, right? Because maybe your IT guy is not going to let you go into SQL and write your own stored procedure to put some things together, but you can make it work if you pull these other data sources together and just combine them within Visio. I'll show you a little bit of that too. So let's switch over. All right, so first I wanted to talk about the basics of setting up the diagram, data linking, those kind of capabilities. As I'm going through this, if you guys have questions, feel free to bring those up. I would ask that you go to the mics, though, so that we get the question recorded. So the first thing that I want to just step through and look at here is, obviously we have some shapes. Some of these shapes come from the web. Some of these shapes come out of the box in Visio. For example, the store shape. I just simply, most of the time, I just go to the search pane, type in what I want. Visio goes through its catalog of shapes and pulls me back, a bunch of different interesting ideas about what I want, what I might want to add to my diagram. But first, before we go into how all this works, I want to kind of take a look at this shape here and kind of dissect it and show you how this is set up, right? Because some of this stuff is kind of automatic and some of it is custom. If I was to look at this shape here without any data connected to it, let me just make a copy of that over here real quick. Uh-oh, there it is. And I'm going to turn off my data graphics, right? So if we take a look at, that's what the shape might look like out of the box without any data connected to it, right? Down below, I don't know if everybody can see that okay, I can zoom in. There's a number of different external data sources that I've brought in already into this diagram, and we'll go through how that works as well. But you can see here I've got records for each of the products or each of the employees or each of the stores that, that work with this particular diagram. So let's turn those data graphics back on, but actually before we do that, let's take a look over here at the shape data window. So we have a shape. That shape has properties, right? So here we see store ID, city, state, etc. Now in this case, all of these properties are coming from the data that I've connected to that shape, right? So in Excel, in SQL, wherever I'm getting my data from, I've got columns that represent each one of these properties, okay? Now, the important point to understand about that, and you can kind of see some of that down here. Let's go to all store sales. I think this is the one we want. So down here, you can see store ID, city, state, etc., right? And each one of those records is linked to a shape within my diagram. So just to bring that point home about the properties, let me just draw a rectangle on the page. And you can see over here on the right, there are no properties associated with that rectangle, right? Now I can go in and make some if I want. I can just right-click over here, define properties. I can give it a name. I can give it a type. I can give it a value, default values, etc. But I can also just take one of these records down here, drop it on that rectangle, and now you see that those properties were created. They've been populated with the data that's coming out of that data source. And whenever that data source gets refreshed, those properties in that shape that are connected to that data source will also be kept up to date, right? And so that's kind of that, when we talk about the data linking piece, if there is any behavior built into that shape, the behavior is based on those properties. So there's kind of a, there's a few steps there that happen in Visio to make all this stuff work, right? The shape has behavior. That behavior is based on a property value, but that property value is being fed from some external source in this case, right? If that makes sense. So when the external source updates, the value gets updated in the property. Visio's calculation engine sees that and says, oh, let me recalculate these formulas, and instead the shape is going to be green instead of blue based on the values that just got pushed into those properties. So that's kind of the mechanics on how that stuff works. Now, when we look at data graphics are kind of out-of-the-box, pre-built visualization rules, if you will, right? And there's a number of different types. You can see over there, we've got Seattle, we've got employees, items sold, data bar. We've even got like a warning icon above the store. So there's actually a number of different elements that are being set up here on this shape, all of which are data graphics that have been configured against those properties that are in that shape. So if we dive a little bit deeper, let me turn data graphics on for this particular shape, and let's take a look at how those are built. And I'll just zoom in here so we can see some of that. So in this case, for this store, the data graphic that I've created for this store is made up of these 4 different elements. You can see I've got a couple of text items. So that's where we're getting the location of the store and how many employees are coming in. And then we also have the data bar, which you've seen down there, which grows and shrinks based on the rules that we configure. And then the last one, you can see that I've got this custom formula set up. If you can see that, it says quantity sold divided by employee count, right? And so what that's doing is that's bringing together some data from 2 different data sources, which I'll go through in a minute and show you how to connect to. And it's doing that calculation, and then based on that, let me show you what that one looks like when I get that set up. So that's what the dialog looks like for that particular icon set. You can see in this case we actually have 5 different icons to choose from that set that we chose. But based on the rules, we only need to use 3 of them, and you can see how we've set up greater than, less than, or in between to surface that icon on top of that shape. And then I don't know if you can see up on the top or upper right, there's a bunch of positioning information we can use, because maybe we want that icon to show on the lower right, the lower left, the center of the shape. There's all kinds of positioning and stuff that we can do too with those data graphics. So let's cancel that and let's go to this blank diagram here that's not set up at all, and let's just go through the steps. So I've got the base visualization that I want. I found my map on the web. I grabbed some stores from Visio shapes, threw those on there to represent the stores. If I go to data, I want to bring in those different data sources that I have available, right? So I'm going to do link data to shapes, and this is the dialog that allows us to choose what data source that we want to work with. The only one that's in this list, and we'll talk about Visio services in a minute after this, but the only one in this list that doesn't work in the browser is Access Database. So Excel, SharePoint, SQL, OLADB, some of your custom sources if you want to go that deep, those all work in the browser. So I'm going to pick SharePoint Foundation list, because actually if I go out to my SharePoint site, I've pre-configured a number of external data sources or external lists using business connectivity services that connect out to a SQL database. So here I've got some simple stored procedures that bring me back store sales, store orders, store employees, some really basic data sources here. So let me bring those into Visio. And I'll choose my list, and there's my site. And first, let's do all store sales, and we'll do finish. And so it's going to execute the query. It's going to bring the results of that query back into Visio. And of course, Visio is not responding right now. There it goes. And so now I've got a data record set that's embedded within this diagram. Right? The first question that usually comes up about this is that data stored with the diagram? And the answer to that is yes. So if I send this diagram to Scott, even though Scott doesn't have access to my SQL database, he's got the results of the query that I ran.
The snapshot at that moment in time.
At that moment in time, yeah. You won't be able to refresh it.
Right.
But if there's data in there that Scott shouldn't be looking at, I don't want to send him this diagram because that query is down there and the results of that query, that data goes with it. So that's, there's pros and cons to that, but, we've always talked about should it be in there, should it be a, not a snapshot in time that's stored in there and always but, that kind of defeats like offline access and those sorts of things. When I'm in the airport trying to build my dashboards for my demos, I can't get to my data source. So, okay, so we've got that data source in here. If I drag and drop this Seattle record up here, I'll just drop it on there. Again, like I said, we get our data properties configured. If I zoom out a little bit, you notice that when I drop these shapes on the page, they already had a property called city. And if I type some value into there, that value is set up for that particular Visio shape, and it's, behavior. It's what we talk about when we talk about shape behavior. So it automatically displays as text the city property. So that's kind of nice because I can just type into that property window. The shape the text gets formatted and displays on the shape properly. I'm going to actually use that for my data linking because now that I've got n number of records that I've brought in from my data source, and I know that these shapes have probably values that correspond to that data, Visio actually has the ability, if I go through this and say, hey, you know what? Why don't you match up the value that's in the city column with anything that you find in the shape's text and see if there's a match, and if there's a match, link everything up for us, right? And so I'll do that, and I'll hit finish. And now if I look through and click on Portland, Boise, Las Vegas, you can see they all have properties. They all have the values automatically pushed into them. So I know there's 5 or 6 shapes on here, and I could have dropped each record individually. But if we're talking
But I'm fundamentally lazy, so I like this.
Well, yeah. And when you're looking at network diagrams, right? When you've got 1,000 servers in a diagram and you just want to bring in the KPIs for that server, right? You can hit that, choose IP address or network name or something like that. Boom. We link all your SQL data or your system center data or whatever out to all those shapes. So now that the properties are all in there, right, it's up to you to figure out what your visualizations are going to look like. Now, we've got sales goal, quantity sold. That's pretty easy to put a data bar in for. But I want to really know, more performance information about that store. And I'm going to get that from another data set. So I'll go to the same SharePoint site, and I'm going to pull in store employees. All right? And now I'm going to have 2 data record sets that are cached in this diagram. And this one's pretty simple. It just tells me, hey, for store ID, you have this many employees. But the nice thing about that is that I take one record from each data source and connect it to a shape in Visio. So what I just did is I've got a record from store sales connected to that Seattle store, and I've got a record from store employees connected to that Seattle store. So now when I look at Seattle, you see I've got a new property, employee count. Now store ID is in both data sources, so we only have the one, but employee count's new, so it got added. The nice thing about that is when I go into my data graphics, let's just turn that on. and I'm going to edit this custom one, right? When we look at pull that. When we look at those properties now, we have quantity sold from that first data source, and we have employees count from that second data source. And so we can do formulas and different things in our data graphics, in our shapes, in our text fields, wherever you want in Visio to put those custom behaviors at. Let's actually take a look real quick, because that's a pretty simple scenario. One of the other things I like to do is link to another data source. Let's bring this in just real quick, because this actually comes up a lot. I've got a source that I call my top 5 orders for the store. Now what this is this is a running list of my top 5 orders. Obviously there's an ID for order 1, order 2, order 3. And you actually might see that over there on the far right under order rank. So this is my primary key for that data source. The reason it's the primary key for the data source is when you connect a record to a shape in Visio, the primary key is pretty important. That's going to tell Visio where that data is coming from. When we have a situation, if I was to use in this case, order ID or something like that, this is the top 5 orders, that order ID might fall off of that data source eventually. It might not come back from the query. And because it's linked to a shape, Visio is going to throw up some errors saying, hey, I was trying to find order ID number 167. It's not in the query results, and it's going to throw back some errors. So that's one of the things to keep in mind when you're connecting data into Visio is that make sure your schema is set up, right? So once you get your dashboard configured and you have certain rows, certain columns, certain data types, if you make changes to those, it could cause problems with your data source, right? Usually, you renamed a column or you changed it from a string to a bool or something like that. Visio is going to say, hey, there's an issue there. There's not a match. I'm not going to be able to refresh that, because you might have a data bar that's based on integers, and if you change that to a string, Visio is not going to be able to recalculate that kind of stuff. So that's just something to keep in mind. But you can see here I can go, put, records on these different things, and I can come up here and I can say, it's actually saying product, so I can change the field to, let's see, what do we have? I thought it was item description. Product ID. Oh, it looks like I don't have the description in that right now. Oh, well. But you see the data linking capability. So we'll move on to the third one, which is a little bit more complex. So in this case, we've got a lot of different things going on, but some of the stuff that Scott will touch on is custom shape behavior. And I just like to show this because this is a custom shape. Customer wanted something that looked like a clothing rack in their store or a shelf or something else. And they wanted people to be able to understand that, hey, you know what? There's, some issues with this clothing rack, right? We're running out of product, and we need to know when to restock the product in that particular store or that particular shelf. If we look at this stuff here, if I take some of these items down, right? Let's do something like that. You can see as the data is changing, and I'm manually changing those properties, right? But that's the same exact behavior if the data that's connected to that shape is changing from the query that runs, right? So as the data changes, you can see we built specific behavior into that shape, like, hey, change to yellow, change to red, hide some of those little graphic elements based on these different values. That's a complex shape. It probably takes, somebody with good Visio skills, maybe 2-3 hours to create that shape. But now they have a single shape that they can use throughout many, many different diagrams. And it's got that custom behavior that really tells somebody, oh, wow, we need to get some more product on that shelf right away, right? All right, I think with that, let's switch back over. to our deck. Yeah, sure. Anytime
Come up to
there's
the mic.
questions.
Thank you.
So far is attaching data to an individual shape. Are there options where I could say each row represents that shape, and every time a new row is added, create a new shape? And one of the data fields on there is going to be my latitude, longitude, which will tell me where to even put the building onto my map.
That's a good question. So kind of to restate that, I think that gets back to a larger question of, from data, can we generate diagrams, or can we add, remove elements from our diagram, right, as that data is updated? Out of the box, the answer is no. Visio will not add shapes and remove shapes from the diagram based on changes to your data. So let's take for an example, well, I mean this one right here, right? There's a new rack. It has a new rack ID. You run the query. You know, there's some new rack that's going to be in the store, right? Where does that rack go? Visio has no idea where to place that rack within this diagram, right? And every diagram is different. There's a lot of complexity to layout, right?
And as you suggested, if your specific data has latitude, longitude,
Yeah, that's
so that the data is there to position the shape, then still Visio is not going to do that for you out of the box, but some code that you add to Visio, and I'll show you a couple of examples, can do that kind of thing for sure.
Yeah, and I have, if you talk to me after this, I mean, I've got a solution. You can have all the code. It generates diagrams from data. It does what you're asking for. So.
The main scenario we're looking for is our network diagram.
Yes. Yep, totally agree. Looks like we have another question, though.
Yep.
So one more question, then we'll continue.
You mentioned that you're keeping the actual data stored on here when you transfer the file, but you also said the query and the connection string settings and all of that stuff. Does that go with the file?
That goes with it. Yeah.
The security is in place on the connection file, then it does go with the file on that place. Okay.
That is correct. Yeah. Each one of those data sources, if you were to pop into like VBA and look at all the connection properties for that, you would see the string, the query, the data connection, all that stuff. Yep. Yep. Correct. Yes. And you should, I mean, best practice there would be to use Office data connection files, have those files stored and secured in SharePoint, then Visio, Excel, other sources are using that single point to do the authentication and get your data. Okay. How many people in here are making use of Visio services? Okay, a few. So Visio services, we launched that with Visio 2010, SharePoint 2010. Visio services is a way to render Visio diagrams in our browser, right? So similar to Excel services and some of the other web apps that we have, when you store a Visio diagram in a document library, you can, any user that has access to that document library can click on the diagram, and that diagram is going to render for them in the browser, right? They can navigate through the pages, they can take a look at hyperlinks, they can pan, they can zoom, they can even click on shapes that you've data linked, and they can see that same property window that I was showing you in the client. They can see property names, property values, that sort of thing. Now, when we have data graphics set up, right, and a data record set that's connected into that diagram, when the diagram refreshes, Visio services will actually see the data connection. It'll try to go out to the data source, execute that query, and bring the updated data back. And if there's updated data, Visio will go through and it'll recalculate all those formulas you've built into your shapes to say, hey, turn red or green, or, hide half of that clothing rack because, the rules that are built into this shape require us to do that. So Visio actually will go through and recalculate all that stuff that's in the diagram and bring that back. It brings it back as a PNG, as you can zoom in and zoom out. There's multiple levels and quality standards for those PNGs. It's all done with HTML. We used to do it with Silverlight in 2010. One of the main reasons for that was Visio is a vector graphics application. Silverlight is vector-based. So it was, it matched very well to our style. But as we move forward into the mobile world and making, everything accessible on all devices, HTML is HTML5 and PNG is the way to go for Visio services. Put my clicker down. There we go. Is it not working? There we go. So with those refreshable diagrams, they're not editable. That's the first question that we get is, can we draw in the browser? Can we add shapes in the browser? Can we move shapes around? Now, with formulas, right, and some of the data refresh capabilities that I've been talking about, you could certainly put a formula in the shape to make the shape disappear or appear based on data changes, but we can't add new shapes or remove shapes from the diagram in the browser. You're not going to, the only thing you can do is click on a shape, see its properties, do a data refresh. That's about it. The client is all about designing that dashboard experience, setting up the smart shape behavior, connecting the data to it, setting up your visualizations, your conditional rules for visualization before you do a publish. Now, we'll look at this a little bit, but once you get that diagram into SharePoint, like I said, you can click on the diagram and it'll render full screen in the browser. There are ways to customize that and add that Visio diagram to other SharePoint pages within your site. The Visio Web Access web part is one of those. So we have our own web part. You can go to any page in SharePoint and add our web part and then tell the web part what diagram you want displayed, what page you want displayed, what's your zoom level. Do you want interactions like hyperlinks to work or zoom to work? Because maybe on a page you want to like focus in on like Washington State or California or something like that. You can lock down all that stuff and just make it part of that visualization. Once you add your Visio web part to a page, if you want to dive even deeper, there's a JavaScript API that's available for Visio services. So, and I'll show you a little bit of that, but one of the things I like to do is dynamically provide additional information about the different shapes and their status within the web part as HTML panels that pop up when people click on stuff, right? To give them more, because okay, why is that room red, right? Oh, that room's red because, and we can list out a bunch of information about that, who the patient is, who the nurse is, what medications they have, what illness it is, all that kind of stuff, right? Just enhance the experience, enhance the user experience, make that dashboard a little bit more meaningful. So let me switch over here. Yeah. So I'm not going to go through and build this dashboard, but let me come over here and show you the experience. So this is the full screen experience of that same diagram that I've saved to a document library, right? I went to my document library, I clicked on the Visio diagram, and this is what I get. So I see the rendering, like I said, those data graphics, because they're data linked, Visio services went out to my data source, ran the query, updated the shapes, brought all the information back. These shapes have hyperlinks on them, right? As you saw in my diagram, I've got a multi-page diagram that drills down into some of this stuff. And it's working well this morning. There we go. So it drills down into page 2. Not sure why we're getting that refresh error right now, but we'll keep drilling down. And then it drills down into page 3. You can see I can zoom in, I can pan around, I can open up this shape information pane that's pretty small down here in the right corner, but if I click on a shape, right, I can see all its properties and what's going on in any hyperlinks and that sort of stuff. Now to make this more exciting, we throw some web parts together and some JavaScript, right? So we have the Visio web part up on the top. Same diagram, same data connections, all that kind of stuff. So Visio is still going to render it and refresh it just like it was. But we've added some additional capabilities where as I click on different stores, I have another Visio web part in the bottom right that pulls up that store's organizational chart, right? And you can, it might be kind of hard to see, but there's data graphics on each person there to show like, are they hitting their quotas for sales within that store? And then there's also a performance chart over on the left. So as I click around, things are getting updated. And then if I zoom in here, if I click on one of these shapes, I've customized the experience even more. See, there's the Seattle org chart there. I've customized the experience even more. Instead of just letting the default hyperlink show up, I've added my own HTML to the shapes as people are like maybe on their iPad walking around the store doing things. They can click on the shape and they can see more actions that they can take through that. Actually, let me drill down to that. Still having that same issue there. There we go. I've added the same kind of capabilities there. You can see there's my top 5 orders that are getting refreshed. There we go. So let's zoom in. Let's take a look at our cowboy hats here. And if I click on that, let me zoom in a little bit more, make it bigger. So you imagine if I'm walking around that store with my iPad checking inventory, I can walk right over to the rack. I can hit it. I can say, yep, we're actually low on this product. And then using some HTML that I popped up here, I can say, hey, why don't I kick off a restocking order or a warehouse request to get more of that product in the store. You know, that might be a simple info path form or a web form or whatever that stores an item, kicks off a workflow, and gets people into all the approval process and everything to get the orders back. But, I mean, the point here is that we've taken a simple Visio diagram, we've connected data to it so that data can drive all the behavior of the shapes and make something that makes sense for our business, right? In this case, our inventory and everything for our business, and gives people the insights that they need, right, to make decisions like this, right? Let's order some more of this particular product. And how do we do it? It's right here in my face. I can just click this button and make it work. So we can extend those Visio diagrams even further with, I mean, the API is pretty simple, but with it, we can do some pretty powerful things with that. So with that, I'm going to switch over to Scott.
Okay.
And Scott is going to talk about process and shapes. And like I said, you know, we'll stick around for, got it?
Yeah.
We'll stick around for questions and stuff about all this content.
One of the really nice things about all of what Chris showed you is that it happens without the need to write code. All of the features to link to data, to present data visually, and then to publish to SharePoint, that's all built in. He's used some code creatively to add value, as he pointed out in several cases. Well, I'm gonna take, so that's kind of the macro view. I'm gonna take sort of the micro view at this point and dive into a couple of shapes and show you a little bit about some of what goes on inside Visio to make shapes more than just a thing on the page. If I say shape sheet, how many of you know what I mean? Yeah, higher percentage than I expected. Good, good. Well, the rest of you will within a matter of minutes, but we're going to talk about what that thing is. I mentioned my background focuses heavily on business process, and so I'm going to use Chris's restocking example as the launching point for a couple of diagrams, and we'll use those to dig into the shapes. These are all different styles of business process diagrams that exist out of the box with Visio. You'll also see in my final example, it's possible to create your own style of business process diagram with your own smart shapes or any other kind of diagram, whatever you'd like to create. But the key is what is it that goes on inside the shapes in Visio? So here is a simple flowchart. This is inventory restocking. This is probably the dummies version of inventory restocking, just a few shapes. We've got somebody who's checking KPIs, key performance indicators. If they're okay, we're done. If not, we're going to contact the store manager, figure out what's going on in the store, make some inventory restocking decisions, and so forth. Totally trivial by design. What I want to do, though, is focus on the shape. So here's a particular shape, KPIs okay. Chris has already shown you the data that lives inside shapes. A significant percentage of the templates and the included stencils include shapes that have data predefined. If you want to define your own data or extend the data that's here, Chris has already shown you that. You can right-click and define shape data. Or you can use data linking. I could link to an Excel workbook where I have all my KPI data, because that's not a set of fields that are predefined in a Visio flowchart. I can link to a data source and add those fields to my shape. So I can enhance the value of the shapes to meet my business objectives. So what does all that mean inside Visio? Now, for those of you who weren't sure what the shape sheet was when I mentioned that word a moment ago, The shape sheet you can think of in a couple of different ways. For the technically oriented, think of the shape sheet as a window into the Visio object model. For me, I tend to think of the shape sheet as that set of 100+ values that all drive the behavior of a Visio shape. There's the Visio engine, the code that does all the work behind the scenes, and most of what the Visio engine does is controlled by and driven by the values in this shape sheet. The key to seeing the shape sheet in Visio is to turn on the developer tab. You'll notice up in the top part of my screen here that there is a developer tab in addition to the other tabs. So just go in to customize the ribbon, same as you would in Office or in any of the other Office products, and you can turn on the developer tab. Once it's on, then what I can do is either of two things. I can go to the developer tab and click Show Shape Sheet, and here I see 3 entries. One that says Shape, one that says Page, and one that says Document. Very important point. It's not just the objects on the page that have one of these magical shape sheets attached. Every object in Visio does. So a page has its own shape sheet. The document itself has a shape sheet, and you can use those as repositories for data of your choosing, in addition to the values that Visio stores there. The other alternative is simply to right-click on a shape, right-click, and choose Show Shape Sheet. Now, if you've never seen that entry on the right-click menu, that's because you don't have the Developer tab turned on, or you're not running in developer mode. So let's click Show Shape Sheet, and here it is. It looks like an Excel shape sheet with some particular formatting. There are sections. I can open and close sections simply by clicking the blue header. In this case, the Shape Transform section contains a bunch of values that have to do with where the shape lives on the page. You'll notice that some cells here, like pin X and pin Y, have specific values, 4.125. Others have formulas. So some properties within a shape derive their values from formulas that calculate based on other properties. The particular section that I want to talk about for just a moment is this section called Shape Data. This is where the data values live. So over here in the upper right of the screen, you see the Shape Data window, cost, process, owner, and so forth. Those are the predefined fields in this shape. If we zoom in the Shape Data section here, you'll notice the very same name. So the fact that those things appear, shape names, or field names, excuse me, and field values, the fact that those appear in the Shape Data window is specifically because of the existence of these rows in the Shape Data section of the shape sheet. And this is a two-way street. If I scroll over here, you'll notice there's a value column, and you'll see there's a value 3 in the row for process number. Well, that's just to prove the point. I can change this 3 to a 33, and if I now look at the shape sheet, you'll see that the value is 33. I mentioned two-way street. If I want to, I can change the value to 55 here in the shape sheet, and you'll see that in the Shape Data window, that value is now 55. Why does that matter? Because a lot of what you're going to want to do to make a shape more intelligent is to either change values in the shape sheet manually, probably when you're designing shapes, or you're going to write code, and much of what that code is going to do is to change values in the shape sheet. So you're letting the Visio engine do the majority of the work simply by knowing where to put values and what values to change, or what formulas to embed in which cells in the shape sheet. So, simple diagram, simple flowchart, just data. I haven't even touched on a lot of the other things that are there in the shape sheet, but let's move forward and look at a different kind of diagram and see a little bit different shape behavior. This is a BPMN version of the same diagram. So should look pretty much the same, except that you notice that the shapes are adorned in some cases with icons in the upper left. Doesn't matter whether you're familiar with the business process model and notation, BPMN, that's standard for creating process diagrams. My focus is the shapes. Now these shapes are built to conform to the rules of BPMN. And one of the things that BPMN says is that your diagram will have icons that represent the type of task or the type of loop or the type of decision that are in your diagram. So you notice that if I open the shape data window, there are predefined properties for each of the shapes. Let's take this task, check KPIs, and we see a number of data fields, one of which is task type. And right now, it happens to be set to a value of user, but that is a drop-down list, and I can check, choose something like manual. Notice that the little head and shoulders icon in the upper left corner of that shape is now a hand. That's the visual reflection of manual. I can just arrow down through that list, and we see other icons that appear in the top left corner. Why? Because this shape was designed with multiple parts. One of the parts is a shape in the upper left-hand corner that derives the icon it represents from a data value in the parent shape. So it's simply a matter of linking a subshape inside to a data value on the parent shape. Now, there are certain of these data values that have other properties. Watch in the shape data window in the upper left as I arrow back up and I get to abstract. Notice an abstract in BPMN means there's no icon. It's blank. When I go to script, there's a little icon change, but watch the shape data window. When I go away from script or back to script, what's happening in the shape data window? There's another field that's appearing or disappearing depending on the data value. Another reflection of the type of intelligence you can build in. Certain times a shape represents X and it needs to have a certain set of properties. Other times it represents Y and it needs to have different properties. How does that happen? No big surprise at this point. I'm going to go show you something in the shape sheet. Let's right-click and show shape sheet. And once again, I'll close the sections I don't care too much about. A quick mention of the user section as I scroll by it here. In addition to the shape data reflected externally, there's also a user section, and you can create user-defined cells here that can contain absolutely anything you want. Visio actually generates and uses a reasonable number of user-defined cells that you never see or know about directly unless you look in the shape sheet, but you can define and use your own. But I'm going to go past that for the moment, and in fact, let's close it, and look at the shape sheet, the shape data section of the shape sheet here. Look at the number of shape data rows that there are, probably, 12, 15, compared to what you see in the upper right-hand corner. A lot more than what appear visibly. That's because of this column over here that says invisible. Here is a value, for example, that's true, the value true in the invisible column that applies to a shape whose name is BPMNID. You don't see that in the shape data window because it's set to be invisible. Why? Because in this particular version of this flowchart, we don't ever need to see that value. On the other hand, remember that when I changed the task type to script, a new data field appeared. So let's look at that one. Down here we see BPMN script. And if we scroll over to its invisible row, or its value, you see a formula there. I'm not going to bother to decipher the formula, but the notion is very straightforward. You can condition whether any one data field is visible in the shape data window simply by having a formula that's hooked to whatever you need to hook it to. So I can say if the value of the task type is script, then make this field, this additional field visible, or set of fields visible. Again, just touching the surface of some of the kinds of things that you can do with shape data and with the shape sheet. I'm going to go to a third diagram type here. This is a swim lane diagram. Same exact inventory restocking flowchart, but built in a swim lane format. Before I actually do anything in here, I'm running two different virtual machines on my PC here. We happen to be running in a virtual machine called Scott. If you look at the very top of the screen, you'll see that. I'm going to click on the tab to the left. I'm going to take a quick divergence to show you another interesting capability that you may not have known about. This is my colleague Rebecca, who is looking at the same flowchart, the same swim lane diagram, as a web part. So she's clicked on it in SharePoint. She's opened it. She does not have Visio, but she's able to look at the diagram, and as Chris showed, she can interact with it and do other things, pan and zoom and so forth. Well, Rebecca looks at this shape right here, in fact, these two shapes at the bottom, and she's thinking to herself, you know what, this really ought to be a sub-process. There's more work than just placing an order and filling the order. We need to think about how to do that. So she's going to click the button up here that says Comments. So think what I'm doing here. I'm Rebecca. I'm using nothing more than a web browser, and I'm going to click Comments. Should this be part of a sub-process? Spelling notwithstanding, as soon as I click outside that box, you see a little squirrely gigs there that says Sharing. So using nothing more than her web browser, she has added a comment into that Visio diagram. So I'm going to switch back to the other virtual machine. So that's happened on some machine somewhere. Now I'm back to being Scott again. And I'll go show you a couple of things. And in a few moments, if you look in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, just glance there every once in a while, you'll see a little message appear that says, hey, something happened to this diagram. I think it says Updates Available. Meanwhile, though, what I'm going to do is assume that I know what Rebecca's thinking. I'm going to go ahead and create the sub-process. I'm going to select these two shapes, and I'm going to go to the Process tab, which appears if you have the Professional Edition, not the Standard Edition of Visio. I'm going to click a button that says Create from Sub-Process. Visio is going to do 4 things for me when I click this button. Click. First thing it did is replace those shapes with a sub-process shape, on which I can type something like Resolve Issue. So now I've got that sub-process shape is identified. The second thing it did is add a page. I didn't point this out, but there was only one page, page 1 in the lower left-hand corner here a moment ago. Now there are 2. The third thing Visio did is to actually replicate my swim lane structure onto the second page. And it took the 2 shapes I highlighted and it put them there. I'll come back to this page in a moment, but let's go back to page 1. I said Visio did 4 things. The 4th thing that it did, let's zoom in on this shape. When I hover over it, you'll notice that it's a little tiny on this screen, but there's a little hyperlink indicator attached to the cursor, and if I hover there, it says page 2, control-click to follow the hyperlink. So Visio added a hyperlink to this shape that takes me to page 2. And I'll click on it in just a second, but $65,000 question, where do you suppose that hyperlink information is stored? Bingo. Sure enough, let's just take a quick look. Right-click, show shape sheet. Everything about every object in Visio at some level lives in the shape sheet. So sure enough, here's a hyperlinks section. And there is an address field, which is blank. And by the way, anytime you're in Visio, if you create a hyperlink to another shape within the same diagram, the address field indeed must be blank, but it will be blank. And then to the right is a sub-address field. Now here in the sub-address field, there's a formula that says, we go to page 2, and I'm not going to show you all the, decode that again, but just realize that this is a formula. It is a formula rather than a literal value of the page name, so that if you change the page name, the hyperlink will still work. And sure enough, we can control-click on this shape to follow the hyperlink. Let's do that. Control-click. Oops, let me close the shape sheet here, and we'll control-click. So the hyperlink is valid. It works. I can now flesh out this part of the diagram on my sub-process. Oops, I don't want to move that guy. Let's resize these. All the work's going to be the inventory associate down here, so we're going to make that swim lane bigger. And I can do things like add a decision because maybe we want to decide, check the inventory in another store. If there's inventory in another store, we're going to bring that to this store instead. If there isn't, then we'll check with our warehouse. If there's no inventory in the warehouse, then we go to the manufacturer. So I'm not going to build the process map for you, but that's the idea. Yes? Can you step up to the microphone? Sorry.
With Visio services, does that hyperlink become automatic? So you just click on it, it's not a control click?
Yes, once the hyperlink is embedded in that shape, unless you disable hyperlinks in the web access area in Visio, in the SharePoint, you will be able to click on that and follow the hyperlink, absolutely. Okay. So whether this is drilled down for a network diagram, Chris's store diagram, or a flowchart, those hyperlinks are there. Now I do want to show you one more kind of cool feature of shape sheets and or that is manifest in the shape sheet, a property of swim lane diagrams. Let me open the shape data window. And there is, if we look at it here, a field called function, and it has a value of inventory associate. I did not type that into this shape. And just to prove that point, let me do this. I'm going to go over here to this swim lane that says inventory associate, and I'm going to change it to clerk. Now let's look at the function. Swim lane diagrams are constructed using my favorite features in Visio 2010 and 2013 and now 2016, lists and containers. And I've done whole seminars about lists and containers, and Chris thinks I'm the only person who actually does use them, but they're fun. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do. This is a case where each swim lane is a special shape type called a container. One of the cool things about containers is they know what's in them. And objects in a container not only know they're contained, but they know where they're contained or by whom they're contained. And that's exactly what's going on here. If I take this shape and I move it, notice it now has a function of inventory manager. Just quickly, take a look at the shape sheet and see why that's happening. This is the area of interest right here. The value of this shape is derived from this formula. Container sheet ref is a way for this shape to get a reference to the container in which it lives. And this container happens to be of type swim lane. Finally, we see user.viz heading. That's one of those user cells that I mentioned. That user cell is a member, or is part of the shape sheet of the container. So here's a shape that is inside a container that has a formula for value that refers to its container and a property in the shape sheet of that container. And as you can see, all I need to do is move the thing around or change the value, the name of the container, and this shape knows all about it. All right, just to conclude, I want to show you a fourth example. This is one that is custom code and some custom shapes. This was actually work that we did for a client last year. They have a very specific style of process map that they were already using before they came to us and said, hey, we need some help, because it turns out their process maps were really elegant looking and they were beautiful pictures, but they had no way to reuse anything in those pictures because all they were was boxes with text on them. And what are you going to do with all that text? Not much. So we helped design some shapes. This message that appeared here is actually a reflection of links to external data. Their HR system, their HR department, maintains a master list of role names for the entire organization, 22,000 employees. They want that to be linked, they want each diagram to be linked to that master data source, but they don't want to force updates in the diagram every time you open a diagram. They want it to be at my discretion when I want to update my diagram in case the role names have changed. But they don't want to let diagrams get stale either. So there's a little bit of code that every time we open this document, we check the date and see how long it's been since that list was last updated in this specific diagram. In this case, it's been more than 30 days. So I could choose yes or no. By the way, if I choose no, the timer gets reset by 7 days, so 7 days from now I'll get reminded again. They're nudging these people to update the diagrams regularly. There's another external list too, and that's what that second message was for. So I mentioned these diagrams are structured in very specific ways. Here's an overview page. Here's a table of contents. Keep in mind, at the moment, it's blank. Here is a style of diagram that they like to use. These are the intelligent shapes. I'll come back to these in just a second. If I fast forward, there are a couple of pages here that are for definitions of roles that are used in this map, and a training matrix, who does what and who needs what training based on what's in this map. They were generating every one of these pages totally by hand because they had to, the way their diagrams were built. We'll quick look at the smart shapes, and then we'll answer some questions. Here is a shape, for example, that does have data. And it has a variety of data types. Many of the fields that are here are dependent on external data. And they're also, you'll notice as I change type here, from BSD to QSD or other link types, notice there are shape data fields that are appearing and disappearing in the window, in the shape data window. So all of the things I've shown you about in simpler shapes, this is a very complex shape. You'll also notice that the icon on the shape changes as I scroll through different values for icon type. So you'll see little boxes, documents, computer screens, and so forth. So this is a shape that's got multiple parts, and there's a lot of data interaction among the various parts of the shape, including pre-formatting. This version of the shape has an underlined blue document ID and then an italicized document name. The hyperlink that's there was automatically generated simply by choosing the name of the document. You get the idea. So that's the nature of this, just to show you what we've enabled them to do. Aside from building smart shapes, there's also some code running here too. I showed you that the table of contents was blank a moment ago. Click table of contents, and here now they're starting to reuse their data. This table of contents you saw just generated automatically by clicking the button. Each of the blue bars grabs the section header from a page, puts the page number over on the right like a good table of contents should, and also has some documents. So that's data pulled from the shapes that is now available here. And similarly, there's that training matrix I mentioned and the role definitions page. We've gone to external data. We've grabbed role definitions for this specific map. And I can regenerate this simply by clicking the button. These definitions were pulled from the HR system and installed here. And the training matrix is built in a similar way. It's dynamic, so if the roles change, we'll add new values. These are set up so each cell in the matrix, I can right-click and indicate whether training is required or not, and it will be reflected visually based on the data choices that they make. So I hope we've opened your eyes a bit to some of the things that you might not have known Visio could do. We do have time left for questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please come up. I actually will ask you a question while you're forming your questions. And the first prize is a copy of my book about Visio 2013. Who can tell me the requirement? What do you need to do to see the shape sheet in Visio? Developer tab. I heard that over here somewhere. Yes. If you would stick around afterwards, I'll be glad to sign it for you.
Let's see.
Questions?
How many times does Scott say shape sheet?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah. Give the lady a T-shirt. Yeah. She made up the answer, but it works.
Oh, you got one?
Whoop.
Awesome.
Okay. All right. Yes.
I have two questions. One is about Office 365. When you're using Visio services, if you need to connect to SQL Server database, which is on Azure, or any other SQL Server database, SQL Azure or SQL installed on Azure.
Yeah.
I assume today it's not supported on MSDN based on the article which I have read. Is there any changes that are coming in future that you must be aware of? That
To
will be-
connect to your on-prem?
No, Office 365 to on-prem SQL or on Azure.
Well, you can connect to Azure SQL
It's
today,
it's
but on-prem you can't, right? You can't set up an Office data connection file for Visio services in SharePoint Online that'll connect back to your on-prem SQL to do the data refresh.
the only way which I found it was it's using BCS and then creating an external list and then connecting. That's the only way which
Yeah.
I found out,
Yeah,
but not directly through SQL.
not directly, no. Yeah, BCS is probably going to be the only way you're going to be able to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know of anything on the roadmap that would change that scenario.
Okay.
Yeah.
My second question is
All right.
about, again, Office 365.
Okay.
Custom data providers which you could write using .NET Core today, and on-premise, everything works fine because you can deploy farm solutions.
Yep.
Is there on the roadmap again where I could write an app or something, deploy to Office 365 and could do that same thing? Because these were a few of the concerns that we have, like when we write these custom code, all that
Yeah.
cool stuff which you could do behind the scenes.
No,
if you
I-
take it to Office 365, something.
No, I would still manage that through BCS and like build a web service to pull that out and surface that through.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the custom data provider stuff, you're not going to be able to put your own custom code for data providers in Office 365.
Okay.
So that's one of the limits. I mean, we have custom data providers for Visio services as well. So you can write your own .NET data provider. If you want to, like, I'll give you an example. System Center data, like one of the projects that I did and released for Visio was a connection directly to System Center data. That uses a custom data provider, but that's only going to work on-prem because that's the only place that we can deploy that custom data provider.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question about Visio shape templates and how to easily generate them or find them. I haven't used 2013, but I don't think in 2010 there was a way to easily find Visio template diagram templates. Is there that feature in 2013? Any kind of like store you can go to even buy template diagrams?
We have partners that build a lot of content for Visio. There's a few partners out there that just build custom content for networking or process or I mean one of the solutions that he was showing you, they build that, they build those shapes and those templates. We don't have our own store for content for Visio.
Yeah, so the shape search that Chris mentioned that he uses often does not search all that third-party content. So there is a collection of sites where a lot of that stuff you probably have used Visio Cafe and some of the others, or if not, let me know and I'd be glad to send you a list of sites where network icons in particular, but other kinds of Visio shapes are made available. Some many for free, some for a fee.
Okay. Thanks.
So my email address is here if you want to contact me afterwards.
Thank you.
All right, one more?
Yes.
What happened with the relationship with the directory services team and Visio? I know at one point in time they had like the topology mapper and a lot of wizards and like the org chart wizard to build org charts based on AD data. Are those tools still available and I just don't know where to look for them, or?
You're talking specifically about auto discovery for networking so those aren't available in the product anymore. I mean, that was when I worked at Visio a long time ago. I mean, we purchased that technology. Those companies started integrating that technology in. A lot of those people left the company during the purchase of the product, so it's kind of knowledge, resources. There's a whole bunch of reasons why. But I know the product team is looking at different things in the future because, I mean, somebody in the back there was asking about diagram generation from code, and that's kind of the higher level issue that I think we have to solve in the future.
The good news is there are third parties that do that kind of thing, and there were some up on the floor, SolarWinds and whatnot, and they will actually generate Visio diagrams from a network. Shania, his company in Berlin, does Active Directory. Will pull data from Active Directory and create Visio diagrams. So there are solutions available for many of those things.
Okay.
There's also a CodePlex project for database forward engineering. I haven't played with it much, but I know you can create your schema and visually in Visio, use this CodePlex project to generate tables and so forth.
Okay.
So there is stuff out there. Yeah.
Okay. And yeah.
Thanks.
Actually, I have a follow-on question to that. Chris mentioned this diagram generation. I've played a little bit with that in the past. Which resources would be the best to go for the documentation side? Because I found that to be slightly challenging.
Yeah, documenting what specifically?
So learning about the VBA model, basically,
okay.
and generating diagrams from
From
external
code?
data.
Okay.
Because I did like architecture diagrams, and it took us a long time, but it was eventually very successful.
Yeah, good, good. Couple of things. If you're familiar with Microsoft Virtual Academy, tons of free training about all kinds of things. I've recorded a series called Becoming a Visio 2013 Power User. The first part of it has been available since November. The second and third parts I just recorded a couple of weeks ago, and they'll be out in the next week or two. So if you search for Visio 2013 Power User, part 3 is about 2 to 3 hours just on VBA and using VBA to do all kinds of things. There is an example of a very simple but diagram creation from VBA as one of the many examples I used there. So that's one source.
I will also encourage everyone to check out our Twitter handle as well as Facebook Visio brand page. We'll always distribute all those training videos on those channels. You can always check them out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Oh, actually, one other thought, too. Further response to that question, if you're interested in code as it relates to Visio, there are a couple of books. Graham Weidman wrote a book, circa Visio 2003, a significant portion of which is still very relevant. It dives into the shape sheet. There's quite a bit about code in there as well. David Parker, another Visio MVP, has written a couple of books, mostly oriented at data graphics and graphic things, but he's got zillions of code samples in there, not so much about diagram creation specifically, but lots of good examples to get you started poking around with VBA code and making Visio sing and dance a little bit. Yes?
Services that you're showing. You showed a implementation with a interaction with JavaScript. Is that actually written in Visio itself, or is that more part of the front-end kind of scripting to create that interactivity?
The API is built into the web part. So the web part, you have to put that on a SharePoint page. Every time a page loads with the Visio web part on it, that JavaScript API comes down with it. So it's there and ready to use. Typically, in all of my dashboards, I just have like a content editor web part where I have my chunk of custom JavaScript code, and I put that in the content editor web part. And then when the page loads, my code loads, and we start interacting with the events and whatnot.
And is there quite a good API where we can find that information of how to interact with the objects themselves?
Yeah, so it's actually documented quite well. If you go up to MSDN and look at Visio Web Access API, then you'll get the entry point into, and you can copy the code samples and build a full example just from what's up there. It's pretty complete.
Thank you.
Yep.
And actually, speaking of code samples, it occurs to me if you download the Visio SDK, there are actually lots of really good code samples, including diagram creation.
VBA.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think we're officially out of time, but we'll hang around for a couple of minutes until the next wave comes in for the final session. But thank you for your attention.